The iron latch of the final shutter clicked shut with a sound that felt deafeningly loud in the encompassing silence of the black forest. Elias Richter exhaled, the damp night air catching in his throat. It was the night of the Bloodmond, the blood moon, and though no human calendar marked it as such, the deep, ancient hum that resonated through the timber frame of his secluded cabin was all the confirmation he needed. 28 years. That was how long Elias had breathed in the humid, pine-scented air of the Schwarzwald, and for the last 5 since Hans, his grandfather, had passed, he had upheld Die Regeln. The rules were everything. They were the scaffold of his reality, the brittle parchment protecting him from the entities that considered these woods their sovereign territory. Elias had inherited the role of the Covenant Keeper, a silent, unpaid, and absolutely vital position. His routine was a sacred liturgy. Rule 1. When the moon runs red, seal the boundary. Every window, every door, every chimney flue had to be checked. The cabin, built deep in a glacial hollow where the giant spruce and fir trees suffocated the daylight, became a bunker. In doing so, Elias was not protecting himself from an invasion. He was publicly announcing that he understood the truce of containment. He was drawing a line that the ancient powers, the Die Alte Mächte, were obligated to respect, as long as he respected theirs. The cabin grew smaller, claustrophobic. Elias moved to the main hearth, where a meager fire struggled against the perennial cold. The soft, flickering light illuminated only a small circle around his grandfather's massive, leather-bound chair. Beyond that circle, the shadows were not just an absence of light. They felt like presence, cool, attentive, and waiting. He sat picking up a volume of forgotten German philosophy, a futile gesture. Tonight was not for reading, it was for listening. The silence outside was unnerving. There was no casual chirp of crickets, no rustle of deer through the underbrush. Only the deep, hypnotic roar of the Schwarzwasser, the black water, a creek that carved its way through the hollow miles below the cabin. Elias had grown up with that sound, but tonight it felt like a chorus of distant, hungry voices. At precisely 21:00 hours, the silence was violated. It was not a sound of accident or nature, but a deliberate thud. Heavy, rhythmic, and perfectly placed. Not a footstep of leather or flesh, but something denser, something that carried the weight of old stone and cold metal. It was a measured cadence, a morbid, purposeful tally. Thump in the south corner. Thump moving towards the east wall. Elias' training kicked in. His hand instinctively reached for the old, smooth walking stick propped against the mantel, a stick that held no iron, carried no blessing, but was merely a piece of wood for comfort. Don't panic. Remain central. Wait for the pattern. The rhythm continued, slow and methodical, circling the cabin like an astrological clock. Thump, thump, thump. Whoever or whatever was out there was not looking for a quick entry, it was performing an inspection. It was marking the boundary. When the sound reached the front, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough to chew on. Elias counted, as Hans had taught him, 50 heartbeats, 60, 70. He could not resist. This was the true test of Rule 1, the acknowledgement. Moving like smoke, Elias crept towards the narrow viewing slit near the front door, a feature Hans had built specifically for this ritual. He pushed aside the heavy, black curtain just enough to peer into the clearing. The blood moon, a deep, bruised orange, had finally managed to pierce the canopy. It illuminated the clearing in a sickly, ethereal light. And there he stood, Lukas the Eternal Hunter. He wore a voluminous coat of stitched, dark hide and a pointed, wide-brimmed huntsman's hat that plunged his face into absolute shadow. He wasn't looking at the door, but directly at the window slit, as if he knew the precise location of Elias' eye. The height of the figure was shocking, easily 7 feet, and though his body was still, a subtle tension radiated from him, like a coiled spring waiting for the slightest mistake. Elias froze. He could feel the cold gaze piercing the glass, stripping him bare. This was the moment of the first rule's ultimate demand. If one of them sees you seeing them, do not look away. Do not run. Retreat slowly and show you understand the terms. Elias held the stare, a brutal test of will against the primordial power of the forest. Then he took one slow, deliberate step back. The hat tilted infinitesimally, tracking his retreat, a silent, terrifying nod of comprehension. He continued this careful, agonizing withdrawal until the angle of the window prevented him from seeing Lukas anymore. His heart hammered a furious rhythm against his ribs, but Elias felt a strange, cold satisfaction. He had passed the first test of the night. He returned to the chair. The thumping resumed its relentless circuit, faster now, more aggressive. North to west, west to south. It continued for hours. Elias did not move, did not speak, did not even shift his weight. The fire died down to embers, leaving him suspended between the warm circle of the lamplight and the vast, cold darkness of the forest. Sometime after 03:00, the tally stopped mid-circuit. The deep thudding faded into the sound of cracking timber, a massive weight moving away and dissolving into the trees, heading towards the lower ravines where the Schwarzwasser ran. Elias stayed put until the first weak, gray light of dawn bled through the shutters. Only then did he unlock the heavy iron bars and step onto the porch. In the damp, mossy earth ringing the cabin, the evidence was undeniable. Deep, precise impressions of heavy, ancient leather, or something resembling a leather boot, marred the ground. Each print was identical, spaced with chilling mathematical accuracy, a permanent record of the nightly contract signed between the forest and the man. Elias was a prisoner of the rules, but they were also his shield. He made coffee and tried to focus on the day's tasks, until his eyes fell upon a particular set of tracks leading directly north, towards the ravines. The trail was messy, not the clean precision of the circle, but a determined path of broken branches and overturned stones. Curiosity, the one emotion his grandfather had never fully trained out of him, won the battle against caution. The trail of broken timber led him relentlessly downhill, the roar of the Schwarzwasser growing into a cascade of sound. Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the tracks led not merely to the creek, but to the next violated rule. The pursuit was agonizingly slow. Lukas, the eternal hunter, had left a path designed to be seen but not followed quickly. The imprints were too deep, too perfectly formed in the damp soil. Elias avoided stepping into the prints themselves, sensing an innate danger in completing the circuit of an ancient entity's movement. He kept 20 feet back, following the path of destruction, broken ferns, scraped bark, and a low, resonant energy that vibrated beneath the earth. The terrain shifted, becoming steeper and more treacherous. Giant, twisted hemlocks fought for sunlight, their needles cushioning Elias' boots but muffling the sound of his own movement. He felt like a voyeur in a ritual not meant for human eyes, trailing the remnants of a power far too vast to comprehend. He crested a small, moss-covered outcrop and stopped. The Schwarzwasser rushed below, a churning, cold torrent of water that always felt strangely heavier than any normal stream. On the bank opposite him, standing perfectly still amongst the gray rocks and vibrant green moss, was a woman. Rule 2. Never cross the flowing water when another presence awaits on the far bank. The water is a border, and to cross it is an act of war. She was utterly out of place. This was no hiker. This was a statue carved from human desire, Seraphina the blood-tinted Whisper. Her gown was not merely red. It was the vivid, sickening hue of freshly spilled arterial blood clinging to her form like liquid silk. The fabric seemed to absorb the muted morning light, yet glowed faintly from within. Her back was to Elias, but her posture suggested timeless waiting. The tracks of Lukas ended abruptly at the edge of the creek where Seraphina stood. The two entities, discipline and desire, had met and parted here. Elias instinctively began to back away, the ingrained fear of breaking Rule 2 seizing his chest. The second step was a silent promise of retreat, but the third was stopped by a sound that defied distance and direction. Elias Richter. The voice was not spoken by the air, but woven into the ambient noise of the forest, the rush of the creek, the wind in the pines, the snap of a distant twig. It was intimate, melodic, and devastatingly precise, seeming to originate from a point exactly 6 inches behind his ear. He froze, body rigid with shock. How did she know his full name? Your grandfather's fear was always that you would become like him, a deaf guardian. The voice, Seraphina's voice, was a cascade of honeyed darkness. He taught you the rules of distance, but never the rules of engagement. Elias scrambled back, pushing through a thicket of stubborn rhododendron. Thorns snagged his jacket, but he ignored them, desperate to put distance between himself and the Schwarzwasser. You run because he taught you fear, Seraphina whispered, closer still, the sound somehow traveling through the dense foliage without distortion. But the fear is based on a lie about his death. Elias stopped dead, the movement of his limbs betrayed by the sudden paralysis in his will. Hans had died in his sleep, a peaceful end. That was the official history. But the unsettling stillness of the body, the vacant, upward stare, it had always felt wrong. Hans did not yield to age, Elias. He was consumed by the very balance he sought to maintain. He was judged by the entities he swore to referee. Seraphina's voice became an intoxicating invitation. He did not fall. He was shredded by the agreements he failed to uphold. I can show you the memory, Elias. I can give you the ka tr letter 1e3 thu, the thirst for revenge he deserved to feel. The words were not promises of power, but promises of truth and retribution, a far more potent lure for a man who had lived his life in a lie. Elias pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound was now entirely internal, ringing in the hollows of his skull. 18 years of blind obedience, 18 years of a lie. He forced himself to move again, staggering uphill through the maze of roots and branches. His focus was fixed on one desperate, irrational thought: get back to the cabin. The cabin is where the rules hold. As he broke free of the thicket, scrambling onto the familiar ridge, he saw the roof of his sanctuary. Safety was just ahead, but the moment his foot cleared the last root, his breath caught. Not on his porch, but impressed into the dark, damp earth just outside the clearing, was a patch of scorched vellum. It looked like leather, hardened by intense heat and folded neatly into a square. Elias approached it with leaden steps. He unfolded the brittle material with trembling fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable, the angular, precise script of Hans Richter. The smell was the acrid scent of ozone and burning pine. The inscription was brief, terrifying, and final. Die Ewige Verabredung zerbricht, Elias. The eternal agreement is shattering, Elias. I failed. This is not the end. It is the selection. Du musst den Urban wählen. You must choose the heir. It was not a rule, but a command that shattered the foundation of his existence. Hans hadn't been protecting him. He had been grooming a successor for a failed war. Elias crumpled the burning vellum in his fist, the heat piercing his palm. He looked back towards the deep, dark ravines of the Schwarzwasser. The truth was not in the rules, but in the chaos that had been unleashed. The first rule had been violated by choice, following the tracks, and the second by irresistible temptation, listening to Seraphina. The fragile balance was irrevocably broken. The silence that followed Elias' declaration was deeper than the dark moon itself. It was the profound, dangerous stillness that precedes total gravitational collapse. Lukas the Eternal Hunter was the first to react. His head, topped by the sharp, peaked hunting cap, snapped down, and a sound like a distant, grinding avalanche rumbled in his throat. He took a single, slow step forward, his massive, stone-hewn boots crushing the damp moss. A king, Lukas's voice was dry like grinding granite. The Richter line are custodians, boy, not monarchs. Your grandfather believed he had authority. The assembly removed it. You confuse insolence with power." Seraphina, the blood-tinted Whisper, reacted with the opposite extreme. She laughed, a high silver chime that promised both ecstasy and immediate death. Her form, shimmering like liquid shadow and blood, flowed forward. "My sweet Elias," she cooed, her voice now dangerously close to a lover's intimacy. "Authority is a trick of the will. Come to me, and I will show you that true sovereignty lies not in punishing but in redefining reality. Take my power, and we can tear this rotting forest down together." Herr Grün the Diplomat raised his hand, his emerald glow flickering with genuine anxiety. "Assembly, we are not here for theatrics. Elias Richter, you are committing an act of treason against the Ewige Verabredung. You must understand the gravity." Elias cut him off, his voice firm and unwavering, fortified by the truth he had found in the Codex. "The Ewige Verabredung is dead because it lacked the mechanism for justice. It was a ceasefire, not a covenant. The Assembly executed my grandfather not for breaking a rule, but for undermining the Keeper's sovereignty. You demanded a neutral observer, but you failed to give that observer the power to maintain true neutrality." Elias stepped back onto the porch, reaching into his breast pocket. He pulled out the black quartz stone. It was not spectacular. It did not flash with lightning or emit waves of fire. It simply existed, a perfect, silent void of cold. But as Elias held it, the stone began to draw the ambient energy of the clearing inward. The air around Lukas thickened, slowing his movements. The intoxicating scent of jasmine and rot around Seraphina abruptly vanished, replaced by the clean, biting chill of ice. "This stone," Elias announced, "is the heart of the first Richter's mandate. It is the Anchorstein Anchor Stone. It does not grant power, but it amplifies the Keeper's will to enforce boundaries. The old rule was, observe. My new rule is, if any entity, great or small, violates the codified boundaries, the anchor stone will be used to enforce exile or dissolution." The threat was immense. Dissolution meant erasure. Herr Grün took a step back, his composure finally breaking. "You cannot, that power was sealed. It requires the consensus of the Assembly." Elias fixed his gaze on the 9 silent judges who stood utterly motionless. He knew the truth from Hans's notes. The judges were not inherently good or evil. They were bound only to the principle of recognized authority. They had executed Hans because he lost his authority. If Elias could take it, they were bound to respect it. "Judges," Elias addressed the shadows, ignoring the primary entities. "The choice is simple. Do you accept the chaos of an open war between order and change, or do you accept the Richter mandate, a new sovereignty based on absolute, impartial, and measurable law?" A heavy, resonating click echoed from the cabin door. It was the sound of the grandfather clock, silent for 10 years, suddenly winding its internal mechanism. The clock had accepted the management of space under the new king. This small, physical act broke the impasse. A vibration, cold and ancient, passed through the 9 silent judges. It was their non-verbal assent. Herr Grün sank to his knees, his emerald suit dulling slightly in defeat. Lukas halted his advance, his form rigid with contemptuous compliance. Seraphina simply stood still, her eyes burning with frustrated, terrifying curiosity. "Very well, Elias Richter," Herr Grün choked out, recovering his breath. "The Assembly accepts your claim to sovereignty, provided you adhere to the primary principle, absolute neutrality." "My neutrality will be enforced by law, not by fear," Elias declared. He turned to Fenris, who was now standing fully alert beside him. "Fenris, you are no longer the enforcer of the ceasefire. You are the sentinel of the mandate. Your authority is absolute within the codified lines of the territory." Fenris walked forward, passing Elias, and stood squarely in the center of the clearing, facing the Alte Mächte. He let out a low, elemental howl that caused the massive trees to shudder, not in terror, but in recognition of their new master. The drafting of the Codex Richter. Elias spent the next 3 nights drafting the new covenant in the iron-bound ledger. He did not ask for advice. He issued commands, using Herr Grün as the necessary administrative medium to translate his will into arcane law. Lukas and Seraphina were forced to be present, their simmering tension a constant backdrop to the negotiations. The Codex Richter was mercilessly clear and rooted in the clinical discipline Elias had always possessed. Key provisions of the new covenant. The sovereignty of space, Richter mandat. The neutral territory, the clearing, the cabin, and the first bend of the Schwarzwasser, is now designated as the domain of absolute law. The Richter Keeper holds full legislative, executive, and judicial power within this space. The law of immovable lines, Lukas's burden. All territorial lines drawn by Lukas, the Hunter, must now be visible to Elias at all times, marked by naturally occurring stones, not shadow magic. If Lukas's territory encroaches upon the domain of change, the Keeper holds the right to dissolve Lukas's markings for a period of 1 solar month. The law of contained flow, Seraphina's chain. Seraphina, the Whisper, is strictly forbidden from using emotional mimicry, Rule 3 violation, or offering false narratives. She may only offer a choice, which must be clearly stated, measurable, and finite. Any attempt to use the Keeper's memory or personal loss against him will result in her immediate exile to the salt marshes beyond the Black Forest for 1 year, enforced by the Anchor Stone. The law of the Sentinel, Fenris's authority. Fenris is the living embodiment of the Richter mandate. His judgment on any localized violation is final, and all entities must submit to his containment protocols without resistance. The protocol of succession. The Keeper can no longer be executed by the Assembly. If the Keeper dies without nomming an heir, the Anchor Stone will automatically dissolve the entire neutral territory, releasing all imprisoned power and causing instant, catastrophic chaos across the Schwarzwald, effectively wiping out both order and change. This gave Elias the ultimate, devastating veto power. Lukas signed the Codex first, the tip of his finger bleeding pure, frozen oil onto the parchment, the pressure of his compliance cracking the table where he leaned. Seraphina signed last, her signature a swirling glyph of painful beauty, whispering, "You are order, Elias. You will eventually turn that knife on yourself." Elias simply met her gaze. "I am law, Seraphina, and law requires self-discipline above all else." On the 7th night after the dark moon, Elias stood alone in the clearing. The air was crisp and cold, the shadows deep but defined. There was no terror in the darkness now, only a grudging, immense respect. Elias walked back into his cabin and sat down in the large, polished chair. He was no longer a frightened custodian bound by ineffective rules. He was the architect of balance, a solitary king ruling over a terrifying, complex ecosystem. He picked up the iron-bound ledger, the Codex Richter, and opened it to a blank page. He would now begin logging the movements, the violations, and the compliances of the forces he ruled. His life would be one of perpetual vigilance, but also one of true, self-determined purpose. Outside, the massive form of Fenris, the Sentinel, settled back down on the porch. And at the exact moment the Sentinel closed his eyes, the grandfather clock in the living room chimed. Once, a single, definitive note of established sovereignty. The long, silent vigil of the Richter line had finally ended, and the era of the Lawmaker had begun. The small metal cup lay where Herr Grün had placed it, a point of cold silver on the oak floor. Fenris had nudged it, an ancient, silent oracle, toward the deepest shadows of the room, not the natural shadows cast by the meager lamplight, but the corner where the cabin itself seemed to exhale darkness, a section of the wall beside the grandfather clock that had never quite seemed flush with the rest of the structure. Elias dismissed the axe and approached the wall. The cabin was Hans Richter's final riddle, and the rules were merely the cipher. If Fenris, the sworn enforcer of the treaty, indicated a third way, It could not be a physical object, but a truth hidden within the mechanism of the covenant itself. He ran his hand along the aged wood. It was rough, covered in decades of dust and the faint scent of stale pipe tobacco, but there was a subtle difference in temperature, a cold spot where the wall should have been warm from the fire. Following Fenris's instruction, Elias began to search, not with force, but with the patience of a man raised to understand complex systems. He checked the floorboards, solid. He checked the mantelpiece. Nothing. His gaze returned to the wall, specifically to the massive grandfather clock Hans had always insisted on keeping wound, even though the chimes had died 10 years prior. The clock, carved from a single piece of black cherry wood, stood almost 8 feet high. Elias ran his hands over the base. The wood here was thicker, almost petrified. He remembered Hans's old obsession with the clock, the rhythmic pendulum, the meticulous timing. He recalled a phrase Hans used to mutter: "The mechanism of time is merely the management of space." He pressed against the wall again, pushing with the flat of his palm. Nothing. Then his fingers brushed against the brass pendulum cover of the clock itself. He didn't push into the wall. He pushed inwards on the clock casing. A sharp, grinding click echoed in the silent room. The section of the wall Elias had investigated, a 4-foot panel carved with thick, stylized German runes, retracted with a heavy, protesting groan, revealing a small, recessed vault. It was not a physical safe, but a shelf hollowed out of the earth and lined with lead. Inside rested only 2 items: a single black quartz stone that pulsed with a slow, internal light, and a small, iron-bound ledger bound in gray, mold-stained leather. The quartz stone felt impossibly cold, drawing heat and light toward its center. But Elias reached for the ledger, recognizing the distinctive, faded leather that was not the same as the brittle vellum Hans had used for the rules. This was the Book of Records. He opened it. The handwriting was Hans's, but the tone was different, cold, clinical, and stripped of all emotional varnish. This was the true codex. Hans had not merely kept a rule book, he had kept a log of influence. Each page was dedicated to one of the Alte Mächte. Lukas the Hunter. Hans catalogued his movements, his kill counts, not deer but other, smaller entities, and his strict adherence to boundary lines. Hans's final entry on Lukas read: "The cost of order is stagnation. He is the perfect cage, but a cage needs a keeper to turn the key. He desires the key." Seraphina die the Whisper. Her entries tracked not her physical presence but the emotional erosion of those who lived near the Schwarzwald, the despair, the lust, the madness. Her power was the deconstruction of will. Hans's final entry: "The cost of change is destruction. She is the perfect knife, but a knife needs a hand to wield it. She desires the hand." The final page, however, was dedicated to his own realization. The covenant keeper is not a referee. The lie I lived: to maintain the treaty by keeping myself outside the conflict, to be the human shield. The truth I discovered: the treaty does not run on neutrality, it runs on authority. The entities are not held back by the rules, but by the unspoken right of the keeper to judge and punish any violation of the sacred, neutral space. This authority is not granted, it is taken. I chose the wrong path. I tried to play them against each other, Lukas versus Seraphina. They judged me for becoming a player. Elias, you must not choose an heir. You must become the arbiter of mandate. You must choose yourself. The revelation hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Hans's death was not about the breach of a rule, but the breach of his own neutrality. He became a servant of one faction, Lukas, forfeiting the absolute authority of the keeper. The third way was not an artifact or a person. It was the reclamation of the role's true power, the authority to legislate and enforce, not merely to observe and survive. Elias closed the ledger. He knew what he had to do. He would not choose an heir. He would force the 9 silent judges to acknowledge his ascent to a position of true power, the Richter mandate. He placed the black quartz stone in his breast pocket. It felt like a frozen heart, cold, heavy, and full of immense, quiet power. He looked at Fenris, who was now watching him, the arcane runes on the door glowing faintly. "It's not an heir they need, is it, old friend?" Elias murmured. "It's a king." Fenris stood up. He did not bark, but the massive creature released a single, low whine, a sound of profound, ancient satisfaction. Elias pushed the vault shut. The great clock remained silent. He spent the remainder of the night systematically destroying the remnants of Hans's old rulebook, burning every page, turning the lie into ash. The following day passed in a surreal calm. The forest held its breath. Not a single bird sang. Elias knew the Alte Mächte were observing him, waiting for his final decision, waiting for the dark moon. He prepared himself physically and mentally. He did not clean the house or prepare food. Instead, he polished his grandfather's massive, leather-bound chair, the one symbol of authority in the room, until the wood gleamed darkly. He stood by the hearth and waited, watching the last sliver of the moon disappear behind the mountain ridge. At precisely 22:00, the darkness outside reached its zenith, the total, starless void of the dark moon. The time for waiting was over. The sounds began immediately, but this time they were not tentative or veiled. They were a declaration. First, the deep, resonating thump-thump-thump of Lukas, the eternal hunter, marching toward the clearing. His presence was a palpable wave of cold, rigid air, seeking to freeze the atmosphere into immovable order. Seconds later, the air filled with the sickeningly sweet, heavy scent of jasmine and rot, the perfume of Seraphina, the blood-tinted whisper. Her sound was 1,000 tiny clicks and rustles, the sound of liquid velvet slithering over stone, approaching from the banks of the Schwarzwald. Her power sought to dissolve all boundaries with seductive chaos. Finally, the deliberate, measured footsteps of Herr Grün the Diplomat walked up the porch stairs. The three primary powers stood in the clearing, forming an equilateral triangle of tension: the hunter, the whisper, and the diplomat. But they were not alone. Rising from the deep shadows where the tree line met the clearing, 9 distinct masses of darkness began to materialize. They were taller than Lukas, more fluid than Seraphina, and more silent than the dead. They did not have physical features, but Elias felt their collective presence, a profound, non-verbal expectation. They were the 9 silent judges, the assembly, the ultimate enforcers who had executed Hans. The convergence was complete. Herr Grün stepped forward, his emerald suit glowing like a beacon of cold, pure logic against the absolute blackness. "Elias Richter," the diplomat announced, his voice carrying clearly but lacking its usual smoothness. Even he was nervous. "The hour of the dark moon is upon us. The Ewige Verabredung is dead. The assembly of judges is present. You are required to name your choice for the heir. Will you choose the continuity of order through Lukas, or the necessary, cleansing change through Seraphina?" He paused, allowing the weight of the question to settle. "Choose now, or forfeit your life and the neutrality of the Schwarzwald to the ensuing war." Elias walked to the heavy oak door. He felt the cold quartz in his pocket, a steady anchor to the truth. Fenris rose, his massive body pressed against Elias' leg, ready to follow his master's command. Elias placed his hand on the runes Fenris had carved. These were no longer seals of containment, but symbols of his own authority. Instead of stepping back into the safety of the cabin, Elias pulled the door wide open. He stepped out onto the porch and into the chilling gaze of the 9 silent shadows and the 3 primary entities. He was completely exposed, yet standing in the center of his own power. His voice, stripped of all doubt, cut through the supernatural tension of the dark moon night. "I will not choose an heir," Elias declared, his gaze sweeping across the 9 judges. "I will not serve as a referee for your ancient stalemate. Hans Richter failed because he confused protocol with authority." He lifted the iron-bound ledger high into the moonlight, the gray leather catching the non-existent light. The Ewige Verabredung is not dead. It is flawed. It is based on a lie that the keeper is merely a witness. He lowered the book and fixed his gaze directly on Herr Grün. "You came here to force me to choose a new heir to manage your conflict," Elias stated, his voice gaining a hard, resonant edge that startled even the diplomat. "I refuse the choice. I have claimed the true power of the Covenant Keeper. I have chosen the architect of balance." Elias stepped off the porch and onto the neutral ground, placing himself squarely between Luca's order and Seraphina change. The air crackled with immense, volatile energy. "I am not here to manage your rules," Elias finished, his voice now a command. "I am here to end your truce and declare a new sovereignty. I will be the lawmaker of the neutral territory. I will not observe your violations. I will punish them." Elias slid the heavy iron latch back, the grating sound tearing through the unnatural stillness of the night. Rule 4, the exchange of courtesy, was the most binding, for it leveraged the fundamental weakness of the Die Alte Mächte, their need for formal recognition and procedural adherence. To refuse a simple request for life's necessities when one held the covenant was to declare the keeper an enemy of order itself, inviting immediate, unrestrained chaos. The door swung inward a foot, revealing Herr Grün. The man's suit shimmered, not from wetness, but from an internal, cold luminescence, the color of perfect, flawless emerald. He stepped across the threshold with a delicate, calculated gait, a movement that immediately established ownership of the space he occupied. Fenris remained utterly still, his nose resting on his paws, his eyes half-lidded, the perfect picture of neutrality. "Thank you, Herr Richter. Propriety is the last defense against dissolution, is it not?" Herr Grün's voice was as smooth as polished jade, carrying no trace of the aggression of Luca's or the desperate seduction of Seraphina. He moved past Elias into the center of the room. Elias, armed with the knowledge of Hans's betrayal and the terror of the previous night, held his ground. "The water is in the kitchen. I know who you are, Herr Grün, and I know the rules were a lie." Herr Grün paused by the massive fireplace, his shadow elongated and distorted by the dying embers. He glanced at the hearth, where the ashes of the vellum still rested. "Ah, the truth. It is always so messy when revealed prematurely," Herr Grün said, turning with an expression of polite exasperation. "But you are right. The rules were never meant for your survival, Elias. They were meant for the management of your compliance." He accepted the simple, metal cup of Schutzwasser Elias poured for him, holding it up to the lamplight. "This water, protected and drawn by a Richter, is the source of the treaty's power. It is the acknowledgement that this territory, this circle of trees, this stream, this cabin, is neutral ground, and that you, Elias, are not merely a tenant, but the linchpin of the entire structure." Herr Grün took a single, deliberate sip of the water, then placed the cup down with quiet finality. The action was the renewal of a millennia-old contract. "Your grandfather, Hans, was not a diplomat. He was an arcane arbitrator who established the original treaty, the Ewige Verabredung, after the Great Schism centuries ago. He created a system where Lukas the Hunter, representing order and territory, and Seraphina the Whisper, representing change and flow, and many others would be bound by a legalistic stalemate." Elias listened, his body tense, his hand still close to the axe. And his death, was it an accident or was it judgment? Herr Grün sighed, a small, refined sound. Hans violated the terms of his neutrality. He tried to influence the flow of the Schwarzwasser, Seraphina's domain, to gain an advantage for Lucas's territory. He became a player, not a referee. And so, the 9 silent judges convened and enforced the penalty. They stripped him of his power and his life force, ensuring that the void created could only be filled by the next of the line. By you. "And the rules," Elias pressed, pointing toward the scorched vellum's ashes. "He said the agreement is shattering." "Indeed. When Hans died, the authority of his original mandate died with him. The treaty holds only in principle. The various factions, the Alte Mächte, are divided. Lukas wants the rigid, iron-fisted continuation of the old lines. Seraphina craves the intoxicating, absolute chaos of total power. Neither can move for fear of the other's response, and neither can agree on the appointment of a new keeper. Herr Grün fixed Elias with a penetrating gaze that felt like a geometric calculation. You must understand your true role, Herr Richter. You are not a human in their world. You are the witness and the wielder of the veto. As long as you maintain the neutrality of this cabin, they must operate under the old, restrictive protocols. But if you fail to choose an heir by the dark moon, 2 nights from now, the neutrality is broken. The Schwarzwald becomes an open territory, and the ensuing chaos will not only consume you, but will tear the very fabric between worlds. Elias felt the immense weight of that responsibility crush the anger he had felt minutes before. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the fate of an ecosystem he hadn't even realized was holding the world together. "Why tell me this now? Why not just kill me?" Elias challenged, his voice strained. Herr Grün smiled, a genuine flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Because I, Herr Grün, am the diplomat of the Assembly. I represent the faction that desires perpetual stasis, the maintenance of the status quo at any cost. Chaos is inefficient. Lukas is too blunt. Seraphina is too volatile. You are the perfect instrument of balance, disciplined, isolated, and now motivated by revenge." He stepped closer, his emerald suit filling Elias' visual field. "I have a proposition, Elias. You must choose an heir, yes, but you must choose one who serves the true purpose, order. Lukas is that choice. He represents the immovable boundary, the unbreakable lock. Choose him, and I, the diplomat, guarantee your continued survival and, more importantly, the details of Hans's final moments, the perfect knowledge you seek." The pitch was perfect, appealing to Elias' need for closure and his innate discipline. Suddenly, a massive, guttural sigh escaped Fenris. The sound was soft, but it carried the weight of ages, a gentle condemnation that made Herr Grün's polished smile falter for the briefest moment. "Fenris reminds me," Herr Grün said, recovering quickly, "that you have 2 days left. The Hunter is already marking his outer territory, and the Whisper is weaving her most dangerous temptations. They will approach you. You must listen to them both, adhere to Rule 4, and then make your choice. But remember, Elias, order is the only true neutrality." Herr Grün stepped back, retrieved his hat, and made a small, formal bow, a bizarrely civilized gesture in the heart of the magical, volatile forest. "I look forward to our next meeting, Herr Richter. I trust you will make the correct, mathematical decision." He turned and strode out of the cabin and into the darkness. Elias did not bother to latch the door immediately. He knew the boundary was now permeable. He looked down at Fenris, whose eyes were now wide open, staring intently at the 4 arcane runes he had carved into the threshold. "Lukas or Seraphina?" Elias murmured, finally putting voice to the impossible decision. Fenris lifted his head, his movement heavy and deliberate. He did not growl. He did not bark. Instead, he reached out with his snout and gently nudged the small, rainwater cup that Herr Grün had used. The action was pointed, condemning the diplomat's attempt to influence the choice. Then Fenris lowered his head, and with a small, focused growl, he nudged the cup again, this time pushing it toward the deepest shadows of the room, a vast, unexplored darkness that held more than just dust. Not Lukas, not Seraphina. Fenris was pointing toward a third way, a path hidden in the very essence of the cabin and the rules themselves. Elias realized the depth of the betrayal. The rules weren't a trap, they were a distraction. The real answer, the true power, was stored somewhere inside the cabin, waiting to be found. Elias stood in the center of the clearing, the scorched vellum clutched so tightly in his hand that the brittle edges dug into his skin. "Du musst den Erben wählen." You must choose the heir. The words were a hammer blow, shattering the comfortable facade of his inherited life. His grandfather hadn't sought balance through diplomacy, but through desperation, buying time until the inevitable collapse. The rules weren't a shield, they were a glorified waiting room. He retreated inside the cabin, his movements frantic and disorderly for the first time in years. He threw the vellum onto the fireplace stones, watching the heat finish its destructive work. He needed to think, but the forest outside was now a furnace of noise. Not the sounds of nature, but the cacophony of the Die Alte Mächte stirring. The rules had failed. The truce was over. He was alone, and 3 nights remained until the dark moon, the night of the final selection. He spent the daylight hours meticulously preparing the cabin, not with the rituals of Rule 1, but with the grim necessities of survival. He sharpened the axe, checked the pressure in his small rainwater storage tank, and loaded the old, ineffective deer rifle hands had left behind. Every action was a repudiation of the passive observance the rules had demanded. As twilight bled into the deep purple of the Black Forest evening, Elias felt a strange, chilling familiarity settle over him. It was the feeling he got right before his grandfather enforced Rule 3. Never answer the voice that calls your name in the dark. Silence is the only currency accepted by the hungry. He didn't have to wait long. At 20:30 it began. A low, soft sob carried on the damp air from the southwest ravine. It was the sound of a woman crying, desperate, heartbroken, and utterly human. It was a sound that broke the profound stillness of the Schwarzwald, and it was deliberately aimed at the human heart. Elias walked to the central wall, resting his hand against the cold, rough-hewn timber. His training held, despite the psychological warfare Seraphina had initiated earlier. The voice is not hers. It is a lure, an echo of the hungry seeking a weakness. The sobbing intensified, twisting into genuine, gut-wrenching grief. Elias found himself straining to categorize the voice. Was it young? Old? It carried a particular inflection, a high, clear cadence that sounded exactly like the only voice he had ever truly missed. His mother. A phantom pain seized his chest, an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel since childhood. His mother had left the Black Forest and never returned, leaving Hans and Elias in their enforced exile. The voice was his mother's, aged by sorrow and regret. Elias, main son, I'm lost. I'm cold. Please, Elias, you must let me in. The black water won't let me cross. I need you. His hand was shaking as he moved towards the door latch. The voice, the perfect, flawless mimicry of the woman who had abandoned him, was tearing down the walls of his emotional fortress. She's out there. She came back for me. Hans taught you to fear, the voice wailed, gaining a terrifying emotional precision. He made you a prisoner, Elias. You have the key. Don't let them take me like they took him. He almost did it. His fingers wrapped around the heavy iron latch, the cold metal a shocking contrast to the burning desire in his heart to throw the door open and end the 20 years of searching. But then an entirely different sound cut through the forest. It was a low, resonant growl, not of an animal, but of something elemental, the sound of grinding stone and shifting earth. It emanated from directly under the porch, a vibration that shook the entire cabin down to its foundation. Fenris had arrived. The immense, white-furred guardian bounded onto the porch. It was not the large dog Elias had known since childhood. It was a physical manifestation of ancient power. Fenris's hackles stood rigid along his spine, not just fur but icicles of arcane frost. His teeth were bared, and his pale eyes, usually soft and intelligent, were now glowing with a cold, protective light, fixed on the darkness. Fenris didn't wait. He launched himself off the porch with the speed and power of a battering ram, heading straight toward the southwest ravine. The weeping voice instantly intensified into a piercing shriek, not of pain, but of pure, thwarted rage. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut on empty air. The forest erupted. Elias could hear the brutal, thundering collision of two forces. Fenris's elemental growl, now mixed with the snapping of ancient jaws, fought against a sound that was less a scream and more a grinding whistle, the sound of the air being violently compressed and displaced. The battle moved swiftly and brutally away from the cabin. It was a war of sound and power, visible only in the violent, swaying crowns of the massive spruce trees. Fenris was successfully driving the entity back, forcing it out of the immediate vicinity of the Covenant Keeper. Elias stood rooted to the spot, gasping for breath, the phantom sound of his mother's despair still ringing in his ears. He realized, with a rush of icy clarity, that Fenris wasn't a companion. He was an enforcer, a living embodiment of the Die Realm meant to protect the fragile truce, even from Elias' own emotional failures. It was only after the sounds of conflict faded into the deep, dark heart of the forest that Fenris returned. The giant creature bounded back onto the porch. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at the wooden floorboards, then slowly raised a massive paw. With deliberate, ritualistic force, Fenris drove his claws into the thick oak planks beside the door. Crrrk screech. He didn't just scratch the wood. He carved 4 symbols into the oak, each one angular and severe, glowing faintly with the residue of arcane energy. These were not random marks, but the seal of containment, a new, immediate barrier. Rule 3 refined. Silence is the only currency accepted by the hungry, and sometimes silence requires teeth. Fenris looked up at Elias, his glowing eyes softening slightly, communicating a message clearer than words. The rules are a failure, Elias, but my mandate is not. I will hold the line, but you must choose quickly. The immense creature settled down immediately in front of the door, his chin resting on the threshold, a solid, immovable mass of muscle and frost. He was not waiting for an invitation. He had taken his permanent post. Elias stepped back inside, his hands trembling. He looked at the 4 glowing runes carved into the wood. The seal of containment was not protecting him from the entities outside. It was protecting the entities from the chaos of his own decision-making. He walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of the dwindling rainwater, the Schutzwasser, the protected water that was part of the ancient protocol. As he reached for the glass, he heard a polite, firm knock on the door. A single, elegant rap that was entirely out of place in the chaos of the Black Forest. Elias froze, the Rule 3 terror still fresh in his mind. It's the voice again, a new disguise. He looked at Fenris. The great creature, the master enforcer, was lying perfectly still, head still resting on the threshold. He did not growl. He did not rise. He did not even twitch his ear. His body language radiated absolute neutrality. Elias walked to the viewing slit, his senses screaming caution. He peered through the gap. Standing on his porch, hat held politely in both hands, was a man in the most vivid shade of emerald green Elias had ever witnessed. The suit defied the dampness of the forest, shining like polished gemstone. The man smiled slightly, the expression precise and distant. He was in his 60s, his silver hair combed back with the rigor of a mathematical equation. "Guten Abend, Herr Richter," the man said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to absolute propriety. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a drink of your protected water." Rule 4. The exchange of courtesy. Never refuse a genuine request for life's necessities. Obligation creates respect. But this was no genuine traveler. This was a direct, formal demand utilizing the last, most delicate rule to gain entry. Elias knew instantly. This was the moment of revelation. This was the true endgame beginning. Fenris remained motionless, signaling compliance with the last remaining protocol. Elias' hand went to the heavy latch. He was about to grant entry to the final and most dangerous player.